Evening. Mount St. Vincent University, through its Department of Religious Studies, is pleased to present the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. And I would like to invite Dr. Margaret Fulton, President of Mount St. Vincent University, to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goulet, and welcome everyone to the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series, which is certainly our most prestigious lecture series, and one, I think, that has gained a reputation over the years. That's said by particularly design, Dr. Shannon, to make you realize that you follow in the company of some impressive lecturers who have been with us at the Mount for this particular series. It is a growing and a deserving reputation that has been gained. We look forward again this evening to hearing an outstanding speaker, and this year it has a special significance for all of us at the Mount because it is our Jubilee celebration. It's particularly appropriate then that Mount St. Vincent University, having served the academic community for 60 years by providing education especially oriented to the needs of women, should commemorate its tradition of Christian values with a lecture series that examines those values in our modern technology and global society today. We are indeed indebted to the Sisters of Charity for their continuing commitment to the university, to higher education for women, and to the Christian tradition. You are all most heartily welcome to hear this lecture this evening. Some of you have already asked if you might put the lecture on a cassette tape, and I have cleared that with Dr. Shannon. His only caveat is that you don't publish it. Now that sort of goes against the academic community, which here, you know, it's publish or perish, Dr. Shannon. You're saying tape it, but publish at your and perish. So let that be the warning to those of you who wish to use it for study groups later on. Again, it is a real pleasure to welcome you and to see such a full auditorium this evening. That indicates, I think, Dr. Shannon, that your reputation has run ahead of you. We are delighted to have you here and look forward in anticipation, I'm sure everyone in the auditorium does, as I do, to an evening of challenge and perhaps renewal and a re-understanding and a redefinition of our faith in what is an ever more complex technological society. So on behalf of the university and the Sisters of Charity, again, with great pleasure, do I welcome you and look forward to a stimulating evening.
Thank you, Dr. Fulton. The annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series is sponsored by the Sisters of Charity living in the Halifax province. I now would like to invite Sister Anne Fleming, Superior of the Halifax province of the Sisters of Charity, to say a few words about the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to once again welcome you to the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. As the Provincial Superior of the Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity, I'm grateful that the decision that we made in 1978 to establish this lecture series has blossomed into such a stimulating annual event. Our purpose in funding an endowment to finance this lecture series was to continue to enable Mount St. Vincent University to carry on its tradition as stated in its philosophy and objectives. And I quote, "Mount St. Vincent is rooted in a Catholic tradition marked by a strong commitment to understanding the truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. the university recognizes the need of moral convictions as the foundation of a worthwhile way of life and seeks to develop in students a willingness to establish a priority of values to enable them to judge, evaluate, and decide in a responsible manner." End of quote. We named this lecture series for our foundress, Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton, and we decided on the general theme, Christian Presence in Our World, Past, Present, Future. Elizabeth Seton, as you probably know, was a woman whose life spanned the years 1774 to 1821. During her brief life, she gave a striking example to us of a woman alive with the love of God. She was a wife, a mother, an educator, a foundress of a religious congregation, and through that, a saint. In a review of Monsignor Shannon's latest book, The Hidden Ground of Love, one of Thomas Merton's correspondents is quoted as writing to him, "The beautiful thing about you is that your heart is as great as your mind." I think all of us Sisters of Charity would say the same thing about Elizabeth Seton. We're most grateful to the Religious Studies Department of this university for the scholarship and insight which they have continually evidenced in the speakers they have invited for this series. We look forward this evening to hearing Monsignor Shannon, a noted theologian, lecturer, and author, as he brings to us another expression of the vivacity of Christian thought, as evidenced in the life and works of Thomas Merton, seer for our times. I'm sure you'll enjoy this series of lectures.
Thank you, Sister Fleming. Some of you will recall that in A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens described the period of uncertainty and contradictions which preceded the French Revolution. He described it as, quote, "the best of times and the worst of times, the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness, the season of light and the season of darkness, the spring of hope and the winter of despair." Those words of Dickens have a familiar ring in our time. We too live in a world of contradictions. For example, never before has there been so much wealth, yet so much starvation. Never before has there been so much education, yet so little wisdom. Never before has there been so much power, yet such a feeling of powerlessness as the world seems threatened by its own destruction. And I know of no one who better embodied and integrated the contradictions of our time than Thomas Merton himself. What was said of India by Winston Churchill can very well apply to Thomas Merton's personality, namely, a labyrinth wrapped up in a maze. Thomas Merton was born in 1915 in France of an American mother and an itinerant artist father from New Zealand. His early life was shattered by the painful death of both parents and disrupted by constant traveling between Europe and North America. After a vigorous and frenzied adolescence, his guardian expelled him from England, and Thomas arrived in New York in 1934. He entered Columbia University, joined the Communist Party, completed a master's degree in English, and formed lifelong friendships. In 1939, he became a Christian, a Roman Catholic, and 2 years later, he joined the Trappist monastery of Gethsemane, Kentucky. Out of his experience and study, Thomas Merton speaks of all that prevents and all that fosters oneness with God, one's true self, and with others. Merton was a mystery to himself, and he has not ceased to have something of a mysterious character, an attraction for countless others. The range of interests of this contemplative monk was simply astounding. Zen Buddhism, Sufism, and Shakerism constituted only a sampling of the interests that put Merton in contact with experts both East and West. He felt a strong attraction to Central and Latin America, and he kept close contact with Ernesto Cardinal, the present Minister of Culture in Nicaragua, who had been a novice at Gethsemane Abbey with Merton as his novice master. Merton's letters to Martin Luther King and the Berrigan brothers reveal his lively interest and creative involvement in racial justice and social reform. He wrote more than 60 books and pamphlets, 443 articles, and 3,500 letters. Merton's writings are very unsystematic. He is an essayist, not a sustained commentator. This happened, I presume, because of Merton's extraordinary but scattered enthusiasms. Yet, Thomas Merton remains one of the most original and challenging minds of the 20th century. We are fortunate to have Monsignor William Shannon among us this evening and tomorrow to unravel Thomas Merton's spiritual message to us. Monsignor Shannon is well equipped to successfully meet this challenge. Monsignor Shannon has been a student of Thomas Merton's life and works for many years and is internationally recognized as an authority in the field of Merton's spirituality. William Shannon pursued his early education and was ordained to the priesthood in Rochester, New York. He completed his PhD at the University of Ottawa, and some years later engaged in postdoctoral studies at McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. He has spent most of his scholarly life teaching at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York, where he became Professor Emeritus in 1983. Dr. Shannon is widely known through his writings. He has produced numerous professional papers, articles, and books, including 2 on Thomas Merton himself, one entitled Thomas Merton's Dark Path, The Inner Experience of a Contemplative, and this year, The Hidden Ground of Love, Letters of Thomas Merton. He has lectured widely in both the United States and Canada, and was a consultant for the 1983 television documentary on Thomas Merton. Finally, Monsignor Shannon's productive career has been recognized by numerous awards, among which are the College Theology Society's Best Book Award, the Nazareth College Faculty Distinguished Colleague Award, and an honorary degree Doctor of Divinity from St. Bernard's Institute in Rochester, New York. I conclude with Thomas Merton's advice on how to attend the conference this evening and the lectures tomorrow. In his preface to the Japanese edition of his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, Merton asks us, quote, "Therefore, most honorable reader, listener, it is not as an author that I would speak to you, not as a storyteller, not as a philosopher, not as a friend only. I seek to speak to you in some way as your own self. Who can tell what this may mean? I myself do not know. But if you listen, things will be said that are perhaps not in this talk. And this will be due not to me, but to the one who lives and speaks in us both." Ladies and gentlemen, Monseigneur William Shannon.
Thank you very much. I feel very welcome in Halifax, even though I have only been here since, I don't know what time I got in here, about 2 o'clock, I guess. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to give this lecture. When I was listening to the words of the President telling me that I had been preceded by many distinguished scholars, I just couldn't help wondering to myself, will she say that next year? Also, listening to one's curriculum vitae, I imagine is somewhat like, like listening to one's own funeral homily, and we don't get the experience of doing that. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about a man who was a contemporary of mine. He was born 2 years before I was. A man whom I never met during his lifetime, but a man who has deeply influenced my life and thinking, as he has influenced the lives and thinking of thousands of other people. I'm tempted to say tens of thousands or even millions of people. So wide was his influence, not only among English-speaking people. His works have been translated into more than 22 different languages, a number of them being Eastern languages. As you know, he came to sudden and unexpected prominence by writing a tremendously popular autobiography. When he wrote it, almost half his life, and certainly the most fruitful and productive half, was still ahead of him. And yet that autobiography became a bestseller. Published in 1948, it sold 600,000 copies in its first year of publication. In fact, there was one day on which the publishers sold 10,000 copies, one day. The man I'm speaking about, of course, is Thomas Merton and his bestseller autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain. This book has continued to sell phenomenally. Well over 1 million copies have left the shelves of bookstores, and it is still in print in 2 separate editions. People continue to read it, and in spite of the fact that its theology is narrow and outdated, countless numbers are still deeply moved by the experience of reading it. In the 10 years or so that I have been deeply and extensively involved in Merton studies, I cannot tell you the number of people who have spoken or written to me to say how much their lives have been touched and even radically changed by reading this book. His influence is, of course, by no means confined to a single book. Actually, he wrote 40 or 50 books, a number of them, as I say, translated into more than 20 languages. There are also his collected poems, which run to over 1,000 pages. And he was a formidable writer of letters, well-crafted letters, full of feeling and emotion, often sparkling with wit and wisdom. As the general editor of those letters, I have completed the first of what we hope will be 4 volumes, and this volume runs to 670 pages. It is called The Hidden Ground of Love, subtitled Letters on Religious Experience and Social Concern. Perhaps at this point I might take just a moment to introduce myself to you, apart from the curriculum vitae. I have spent most of my life in the teaching profession, retiring a couple of years ago from some 40 years of teaching at Nazareth College in Rochester. I started teaching when I was 2, just to keep the age straight. 40 years of teaching has led me to the conclusion that the real learners in the educational process are, of course, the teachers. Students pick up a bit of learning here and there, but mostly they are around to make sure that the faculty get educated. The task of students in educating their faculty is to keep the faculty open to the real questions that students are wrestling with. Questions about life's meaning, about love, about how to live with people, how to find peace and tranquility in a world that lives with so much violence, how to experience God and not just talk about Him, how to become an authentic person, how to become a committed Christian. The great good that students did for me in the 40 years that I taught was to open me to the reflection that probably it can be said without exaggeration that the main purpose of education is to discover the right questions and then to struggle with them. For life is not static but dynamic. The real questions we face do not come out of books so much as out of human experience, the experience of the joyful and the tragic, the humorous and the pathetic in life. The dynamic questions that arise out of life's agonies and ecstasies do not admit of easy answers. Sometimes we have to live with the questions a long time before we can discover a halfway satisfactory answer. But struggling with the real questions, even when the struggle does not yield immediate answers, is a much better way of dealing with life than accepting inadequate answers or spending our time with answers to the wrong questions because we are afraid to take the time to live with the real questions. This is just by way of saying that much of what I learned as a teacher I was nudged into by my students. Thus, it was 2 students who almost literally pushed me into what has become a kind of second career for me, namely involvement in Merton's scholarship. I always had a tolerable interest in Merton. I read his books as they came out, kept more or less in touch with his growing prestige and the dramatic changes in his thinking, especially in the 60s. But I must say that it was 2 students who got me into serious involvement in Merton studies. It happened quite simply. One summer, I was teaching a course in contemporary theology, and in one lecture, I used a quotation from Merton. After quoting him, I made an off-the-cuff statement that someday I would like to teach a course on Thomas Merton. These 2 students picked up on that, and whenever they saw me, they pestered me with a question, when are you going to teach that course on Thomas Merton? I finally succumbed to them and said, all right, get 12 people interested and we'll have a seminar next summer. They did, and we had the course. But it didn't stop there. Out of that course grew the Thomas Merton Society of Rochester, an ever-changing and growing number of people who want to come together to study and hear about Merton. And also out of this came an ever deeper involvement on my part in working with unpublished Merton materials, going about lecturing on him and so on. I am certain that had it not been for these two students, I would not be here tonight lecturing to you on Merton, and I would not have had what has become a very absorbing and an exciting part of my life, namely my desire to understand Thomas Merton better, and a kind of apostolate for me to help others to discover him and experience the freshness and the vitality that his spirituality has brought to the literature of Christian spirituality, that his writing has brought to the literature of spirituality in our day. Since this year would have marked Merton's 70th birthday, I think it is appropriate that I enter into the topic that I want to discuss, namely Christian living in an age of technology, with a couple of references that he made to his birth. The first is from Seven Storey Mountain, which begins with these memorable words, written actually in 1946. On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, in a year of a great war, and down in the shadow of some French mountains on the border of Spain, I came into the world. Free by nature, in the image of God, I was nevertheless the prisoner of my own violence and of my own selfishness, in the image of the world into which I was born. That world was a picture of hell, full of men like myself, loving God and yet hating him, born to love him, living instead in fear and hopeless self-contradictory hungers. The second text was written 20 years later in an article in Commonweal in 1966. It also refers to his birth. He says, that I should have been born in 1915, that I should be the contemporary of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and the Watts riots are things about which I was not first consulted. Yet they are also events in which, whether I like it or not, I am deeply and personally involved. These two passages represent really two different Mertons, two different views of the world. The first tells of a man who saw evil in the world and fled from it. The second, the story of a man who saw evil in the world but who knew that he must grapple with it. The first text prefaces the story of Merton's conscious choice to escape from the sinful world he had experienced into a monastery. And the story of that escape is Seven Storey Mountain. Seven Storey Mountain, in spite of its bestseller status, was a narrow, even rigid book. There is a sense of elitism about it that says, monks are better. Become one if you can. And if you can't, then become as much like one as you can. The text of 20 years later comes from a different and wiser Merton. He too saw evil in the world, the inhumanity of Nazism, the horror of nuclear war, the racial injustices in America, but he chooses not to flee from evil, but to accept responsibility for it, as well as an obligation to do something about it. This did not mean, in any sense, a lessening of his commitment to the monastic life or to solitude. It did mean, however, that he had come to the realization that he was not in the monastery to escape people, but to be there for them. What did it mean to be there for them? Merton spent much of the last years of his life pondering the answers to that question. He never answered it fully to his own satisfaction, but he knew that for him it was the right question. And one thing he did know for sure, and that was that he had to be in solidarity with his sisters and brothers in dealing with the problems that they faced in their time in history. In a letter to Sister Emmanuel, a cloistered nun in Brazil, writing in 1962, he expressed the need for that solidarity. He says, I quote, "The problems of our times are very great. People seem exhausted with the labor of coping with the complications of this world in which we live. Yet it is absolutely necessary that we do so. We have got to take responsibility for it. We have got to solve the problems of our own countries while at the same time recognizing our higher responsibility to the whole human race." Now, what happened during those 20 years to change Thomas Merton from a world-denying ascetic to a man way ahead of his time in grasping the responsibility of Christians to grapple with the social problems of the day? The answer, of course, is that quite a number of things happened to him. The most important, I believe, is that he became a true contemplative, and I kind of avoid the word mystic, but I would be glad to use that if you want me to. He became a true contemplative, and he found that contemplation moved him in a direction that he could never have dreamed of when 20 years earlier he had entered a monastery with the hope of becoming a contemplative. Contemplation is a very dangerous thing to get into because it turns your world inside out and upside down. It makes you see reality in a totally different light. It gives you a sense of oneness, not only with God, but with the whole of reality. And that sense of oneness begets all sorts of responsibilities. Now, since I am supposed to talk specifically about contemplation tomorrow morning, I cannot go any further into this for the moment. Rather, I want to speak about the meaning of Merton's return to the world while remaining in the monastery, a return, as I say, which I attribute to his contemplative experience. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment of that return. Certainly it had taken place sometime before he wrote the Commonweal text that I quoted earlier. I would venture the opinion that Merton's sense of social responsibility, which again I insist was the fruit of his contemplation, developed in the late 1950s and is strongly evidenced in what he wrote and said in the 60s. Writing in February of 1960, so that's very early in the 60s, Merton speaks of the almost 20 years that he had lived, quote, in the isolation of a contemplative monastery. Then he goes on to say, I have only recently come back into contact through discreet readings and conversations with the America I used to know. As time went on, some people would question whether the readings and the conversations were discreet, but that's another issue. But Merton expressed his concern that the America he had returned to was not the articulate, critical, passionately independent one that he had left. Instead, it was an America that had become very much of a conformist society where mass thinking was the substitute for personal reflection, and where a community of persons conscious of their dignity, their freedom, their responsibility were more and more being replaced by a collectivity of faceless individuals who increasingly had numbers rather than names. One way of expressing Merton's thinking at the beginning of the 60s is to say that he had moved from the simplistic view of the world so evident in Seven Storey Mountain in which the world is divided into a monastic world and a secular world. Now what he saw was a world in which men and women were faced with one of two choices. Either a society of persons conscious of community and communion, or a society of isolated individuals drowned in the nameless isolation and the unredeemed alienation of the collectivity. And what was going on before people's very eyes was the mighty pull of technology drawing them relentlessly in the direction of the collectivity and away from the community. More and more, Merton came to understand that the real struggle in human life is the struggle to construct the human community with its values of human dignity, human freedom, solitude, and contemplation. The alternative to this struggle is to be absorbed almost helplessly into the collectivity in which men and women give up their freedom of thought and action and become part of the system that controls them and all of human life. This contrast between the community, the place of freedom, and the collectivity, the place of virtual slavery, is, at least implicitly, if not always explicitly, a constant theme in Merton's writings in the 60s. And closely linked with this contrast is the difference between the person and the individual. Merton has much to say about this difference, and much of it he borrows, I think, from his friend Jacques Maritain. The person is the man or woman who lives in community. The individual is the man or woman who is isolated in the collectivity. The individual is simply a unit, isolated from all other units. He or she is a single, separate being, definable only in a negative way. Namely, he or she is not someone else. Individuals live in isolation and alienation from one another. They are united only superficially by an external uniformity that has scarcely any relationship to the inner realities of the human spirit. The collectivity is the mass society that is constructed out of these disconnected individuals, or to use Merton's words, out of empty and alienated human beings who have lost their center and extinguished their own inner light in order to depend in abject passivity upon the mass in which they cohere without affectivity or intelligent purpose. Now, far different from the individual is the person who is the center of freedom and love, linked with his or her brothers and sisters in the unity of all that makes them human and in the sharing of all that makes them one in Christ. Whereas the individual is absorbed into the stereotype, the person is conformed to the archetype who is Christ. For Merton, the fullness of personhood and the meaning of community is to be in Christ. He would want to say with St. Paul, now it is not I, that is the isolated individual, but Christ, that is the person linked together with other persons in the archetype of all humanity who lives in me. Persons find in the community the place for solitude and therefore for contemplation. The collectivity, on the other hand, far from being the place of solitude or contemplation, is the place of what Pascal calls divertissement, a kind of untranslatable word which roughly means distraction or diversion. It is the escape from life's problems and also from life's invitations into activities that in ultimate terms are meaningless. People whose lives are shaped by the collectivity are people who have lost their sense of the transcendence. This means, and this is very important to Merton, this means that they are deprived of their natural capacity for contemplation. In an essay that has become something of a classic, it's even anthologized, namely the essay Rain and the Rhinoceros in Raids on the Unspeakable, Merton describes the sickness of this mass society that has lost its sense of solitude and its capacity for contemplation. And he calls it rhinoceritis. And he is drawing on Eugene Ionesco's play, Rhinoceros, to illustrate what he means by the collectivity. In this play, and I'm sure a number of you perhaps have read it, in this play everyone except Béranger becomes a victim of rhinoceritis. This is a disease which consists in compliance with whatever is the norm of the moment, no matter how absurd it may be. And in the play, everyone is swept into the collectivity and becomes a rhinoceros. Béranger is the last human being left on earth, the last person. And he feels a strong urge to abandon his humanness and join the herd. But something deep in him prevents him from doing so. He persists in remaining human in what has become a non-human world. One of the responsibilities that Merton sees for himself and other contemplatives in society is to call for more Bérangers to face up to the fatuity of the collectivity's illusory priorities and to renounce the mass mind so that they may once again become true persons in touch with what is real. Merton quotes UNESCO as saying, "There will always be a place for those isolated consciences which have stood up for the universal conscience as against the mass mind." But Merton adds, "But their place is solitude. They have no other. Hence it is the solitary person, whether in the city or in the desert, who does mankind the inestimable favor of reminding it of its true capacity for maturity, liberty, and peace." And in the same essay, he goes on to say, the problem today is that there are no deserts anymore. There are only dude ranches. UNESCO has made the same point, that only solitude, which is proper to the community, can save people from the slavery of unthinking conformism. And thus, UNESCO writes, "Forms of rhinoceritis of every kind, from left and right, are there to threaten mankind when men and women have no time to think or collect themselves. And they lie in wait for mankind today because we have lost all feeling and taste for genuine solitude. For solitude is not separation, but mediation." Now, at this juncture, I think I ought to point out something that I'm sure is clear to you, and yet I think perhaps needs to be pointed out, namely, that it would surely be a misunderstanding to think that either the community or the collectivity exists in a pure state. There is a bit of each in all of us. This was also true of Merton, and he would have been the first to admit it. Our Christian task is to expose in ourselves as well as in our society, the illusions that the collectivity lives by, and to work for the building up of the community. The dialectic between the community and the collectivity has taken place within the context of an ever-escalating technology. This has been true certainly since the Industrial Revolution, and probably to some extent through the whole of human history. Technology has had a strong voice in determining whether it will be the values of the community or the collectivity that will predominate in a particular society. Merton did not write extensively about technology, although he read a lot of the books that had been written. He read Mumford, he read Jacques Ellul, but he did not write extensively about this, though references, explicit or implicit, are not infrequent in his later writings, and especially and also in his letters. It is continually open to the temptation to cripple the community and move people more and more into the clutches of the collectivity. Considered in itself and apart from the circumstances in which it operates, it is neither good nor bad. Yet in the concrete, it is never neutral. It either builds or destroys the commonweal. It either serves or exploits the human family. And consistently throughout history, it would appear that technology tends to move in the direction of destructiveness and exploitation rather than toward building and service. I think at least this would be Merton's point of view. At least this is true when technology has not been guided by wisdom. And it seems correct to say that the grim reality of history is that technology has seldom been in the hands of the truly wise. The reason that technology can easily become anti-community is that its general thrust is away from such things as human dignity and equality, neighborly love and compassion, the things that make for community, and toward those things that foster the mood of the collectivity. And this is because the intrinsic goals of technology, namely what it seems to tend toward of itself, apart from the human motivation that may direct particular technologists, the intrinsic goals seem to be power and profit, with the means to these intrinsic goals being greater and greater efficiency. Great power and enormous profit tend to separate rather than unite people. Power, almost of necessity, tends to be concentrated in the hands of the few, and often at the expense of the many, and profit-oriented endeavors tend to enrich even more the already wealthy and to increase the poverty of the already poor. This, of course, is not to say, and Merton certainly would not say, that technology has not achieved many benefits that have improved the style of human living and made life much more comfortable. But it is necessary to ask the question whether these undeniable material advantages have not been obtained at the expense of true spiritual goods. And thus, we have built fantastic ways of transportation, which makes it possible for people to go anywhere they want to. And yet, the irony is that we live in an age that has lost its sense of direction. Physically, we can go anywhere we want, even to the moon. But spiritually, we have no notion of where we really want to go. Or think of the ever-increasing marvels of communication. Not more than a couple of generations ago, a person could not be heard beyond the range of his own voice. Now we have the technological capability of communicating with the entire globe. And yet we have to ask the question, given the fact that we can now speak to the whole world, do we have anything that is worth saying? I might ask that question of the two powerful men who will be meeting soon. Do we have the wisdom to say the things that will be for the peace and betterment of the world? Henry David Thoreau, who was born in 1817 and died in 1862, a person who took a rather dim view of technological advances, was told one day that inventors were on the verge of producing a technology that would eventually make it possible for people in New York City to speak with people in New Orleans. His response was, what if they don't have anything to say? His question still remains a valid one today. The miracle of modern communication systems has brought people together so that their destinies are intertwined. But have we yet learned to speak to one another? We have suddenly come to realize that the word communication can mean two quite different things. It can mean being able physically to be in touch with others, or it can mean being able to reach their minds and their hearts. And the first has little value without the second. There is no point in being able to get in touch with people all over the world unless we can reach their inner spirits. And this we can do only if we believe that all men and women are brothers and sisters who are united to one another spiritually and ecologically in a fellowship that is global in its dimensions. It must be our common task to build that fellowship for the good of the human race. This calls for wisdom, the wisdom that alone can build community and expose the illusions of the collectivity. Merton was not opposed to technology and the wondrous advances it has made. Thus, in early 1968, he welcomed the addition that was made to his hermitage, which included inside plumbing. He counted it a distinct advantage that he no longer had to face regular encounters with the bastard, as he had affectionately named the snake, who had staked equal claims to the outhouse that had served his needs in his first years in the hermitage. And it is equally true to say that Merton enjoyed his typewriter for writing and his refrigerator for keeping his beer cool. The Merton book that has perhaps the most references to technology is a kind of summary journal that was published in 1966 called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. You will not find there any lengthy or exhaustive study of technology, but a number of significant references, and a few of them fairly extensive. Some of the reviewers and readers of this book criticized him, when the book was published, for what they described an overly negative attitude toward technology. In a circular letter which he sent to his many friends in mimeograph form during Lent of 1967, by the way, I might say this is what Merton did with his letters. He'd get to a point where he was writing so many letters to individuals that he would decide to write a form letter and send that to all of his friends. But then he would send individual letters anyway, so he really never got ahead of himself. But anyway, in one of these circular letters, he replied to this criticism. He said, I got a letter from a Holy Cross brother in Brazil taking me to task, as many critics have done, for what seems to be a negative attitude on technology and conjectures. I might as well try to dot the I's and cross the T's on this point. Am I against technology? The answer is obviously, I am not maintaining that we ought to get rid of matches and go back to making fires by rubbing sticks together. Nor am I maintaining that modern transportation, medicine, methods of production, and so on are bad. I am glad to have a gas heater this winter since I can't cut wood. Yet I am not saying that I am a better human being this winter when I have more leisure than I had last winter when I did a lot of chopping. Nothing wrong with chopping either. What I question is the universal myth that technology infallibly makes everything in every way better for everybody. It does not. And he goes on to discuss how technological advance can be used to help people or to destroy them. Thank God, he says, for the fact that penicillin saves thousands of lives. But let's face the fact that penicillin saves lives for people whom society then allows to starve because it is not set up to feed them. If it used its technological resources well, society certainly could feed them. In fact, it doesn't. He speaks, too, of what technology has done in the underdeveloped countries of the world. Multinational corporations have gone into financially backward countries with a setup that works fine in affluent countries, but can be a disaster in these countries that are poor. What happens is that these corporations bring huge profits back to their own country and often dislocate the people of the backward country, many of whom move to the city seeking work and soon find themselves living in abject poverty. Why? Because technology, by developing labor-saving methods of production, has reduced instead of increased the number of jobs available to them. This, Merton says, is a technology that is at the service of profit, not of people. If I were asked to list the faults that Merton felt all too often dogged the path of technology, I would list 5. First of all, a faulty choice of goals. Technology all too frequently is afflicted by a false ethic that gives priority to material progress over moral growth and to efficiency in getting things done over social responsibility. The overriding imperative of technology is what can be done must be done. All too often it ignores the wisdom which would teach us that the fact that we are able to do something does not by itself mean that we should do it or even have the right to do it. Human values, which technology, simply as technology, cannot know, human values may offer compelling reasons for not doing something that we have the power to do. This drive to make possible the real, whatever the real may be, can threaten the values of the community even as it helps to construct the illusions of the collectivity. The second fault, I think, that Merton would find with technology is a more specific form of the first, namely the lack of a proper balance or a sense of hierarchy in choosing its goals. There are many worthwhile goals that technology may work toward. The whole question of allocation of scarce resources is one of the big problems we face in ethics today. But granted that technology cannot do everything because time, energy, and funds are limited, then it must decide priorities among the possible goods it can work to accomplish. And too often, basic human needs are ignored for the sake of scientific accomplishments. Too often, the exotic is preferred to the ordinary. It is all very exciting, although with repetition, even that excitement quickly begins to wear off. To put satellites in space, or even dramatically to repair those that have broken down in space, there is a sense of acting like God when he made the stars and put them in the heavens. And yet, is peopling the heavens our most pressing task? Do we not have a greater responsibility, say, to feed those who people the earth? In 1961, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, promised that by the end of that decade, the United States would put a man on the moon. And on July 20th, 1969, it happened. Neil Armstrong stepped out of his Apollo spaceship onto the moon. A marvelous accomplishment indeed. It was science fiction come true. Yet, one cannot help but think, suppose that President Kennedy in 1961 had said, by the end of this decade, we shall eliminate starvation and hunger from the face of the earth, and we'll use all the technology that we have to achieve this goal. Could we have done it? The answer, of course, we do not know. But should we have tried? Did the choice to put people on another planet prevent us from making the choice to put food in the mouths of all the men and women and children on our own planet? In our technological choices, in other words, does the service of people often yield place to scientific discovery? The third fault of technology that Merton would find, I think, is a false actionism that is obsessed with the need to get things done, and as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Such a mentality is fatal to the spirit of solitude and of love for quiet that are characteristic of the community. A fourth problem that Merton would find with technology is that for vast numbers of people, it has dulled the creativity of the human spirit, for it has made work boring, routine, monotonous. So much so that the worker's sense of his own worth and of his own creative powers have been diminished by the very work that he does. Work becomes, therefore, something to escape from as quickly and as often as possible. Workers are thus drawn into the vortex of that divertissement, distraction, where they lose themselves in activities that are mindless and without any real human significance. I suppose that the soap opera of television has become the stereotype of this kind of soporific activity. Such divertissement moves people in the direction of the collectivity rather than the community. And a final fault that Merton would point to in modern technology is what might be called its Pelagian tendencies. Pelagianism, some of you may recall, was the heresy that said we could save ourselves. Our own efforts were all that we needed. We did not need the grace of God. The myth of the omnipotence of technology is the Pelagianism of the 20th century. We can run our own universe. We have the technological skill. Merton published in 1967 in a small magazine called Seton, a magazine that lasted, I think, for only 1 year, an article that appears to be whimsical enough, but actually is in deadly earnest. It's entitled "The Angel and the Machine." And it shows how the angels, once thought to be our helpers in carrying out God's plan, have been replaced by the machine. So he writes, technological civilization is a civilization without angels, in which we have chosen the machine instead of the angel. That is to say, we place the machine where the angel used to be, namely at the limits of our own strength, at the frontier of our own natural capacity. More than that, Merton points out, the machines are our angels. We made them, not they themselves. They are, we think, entirely in our power. They become extensions of our intelligence, of our strength. They form part of our own enclosed and comfortable world. They stand between us and nature. They form a room in which we are isolated from the rest of material creation, and therefore all the more from spiritual beings. They create weather for us sometimes, and even abolish day and night as we dwell in our windowless buildings surrounded by angels of chromium and steel. And Merton goes on, in our folly, we have tried to convince ourselves that our machinery is sufficient for all our needs, and that there is nothing that science cannot do for us. It is in our anxiety to make our machine world completely self-sufficient and autonomous, something which is no fault of the innocent machine, that we render it spiritually unlivable for ourselves. He suggests that we need the angels, not to replace our machines, but to teach us how to live with them. For the angels come to us to teach us how to rest, to forget useless care, to relax in silence, to let go, to abandon ourselves, not in self-conscious fun, but in self-forgetful faith. We need the angels to remind us that we can go along without so many superfluous goods and satisfactions, which instead of lightening our existence, weigh it down. May they come back into our world and deliver it from its massive boredom, its metaphysical fatigue. What he is saying is that we must and we can live in the world of the machine, the world of technology, and still build the community. But we need the wisdom that comes from God, a wisdom that earlier ages personified in the form of superhuman beings. Without needing to explain what precisely early ages meant by these angelic beings, we need the wisdom they personified, the wisdom that was their message from God. I'm almost finished. Almost all societies have recognized the way of wisdom. It has been respected not as a flight into illusion, but as a return to reality in its hidden ground and roots. Indeed, special homage has been paid to those people who have attained to the inner meaning of life and being, who have expressed this meaning for their brothers and sisters, and who have been able to unite in themselves the divisions and complications that confuse the lives of their fellow men and women. This can also be true in a technological society, but only if it is ready to renounce its obsession with the triumph of the isolated individual and the collective will to power, in order to adopt a different view of reality that springs from solitude and contemplation and constitutes the life of the community. The fundamental question posed by the contrast of community and collectivity is, do we mechanize the person or do we personalize the machine? I have tried to suggest, all too inadequately I'm afraid, that the way to build the community and to overcome the pull of the collectivity is the way of contemplation and solitude, the way of wisdom. And yet, I need to point out that even if we have a commitment to wisdom, to solitude, and to contemplative living, we may not always be in agreement as to what is best for the community. Whether that community be the family, the parish, the religious community, the national community, the community of nations, the community of the church. Thus, for example, what the church in Latin America has learned through its solitude and reflection on the gospel may not agree with what Vatican officials have concluded from their own prayerful reflection. We cannot but feel, when we think for example, of Father Leonardo Boff and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, that each believes that the position he is taking is the one that will best help to build the community of the church. And inevitably, we are going to take sides in these issues. Yet it would be sad if we did not talk with one another, and through further solitude and reflection, let the Spirit of God, who is the Spirit of unity, help us to work out the tensions that inevitably arise even in the community. I think it is significant that Cardinal Ratzinger did not condemn Father Boff's writing, but told him to take a year and spend it in reflection. Father Boff is doing this. I had a letter from Sister Emmanuel, who is in the same city, Petrópolis in Brazil, saying that he is not teaching, he is not lecturing, he is spending the time in reflection. And I have no doubt that this reflection will be most fruitful for the good of the Church of Latin America, and therefore that Cardinal Ratzinger's recommendation to him will eventually be helpful to the Latin American Church. Of course, we might have felt happier about it if Cardinal Ratzinger had said, I will also take a year to reflect about these matters. And yet, we must not prejudge the commitments that he may have to his own solitude. Meanwhile, I would like to conclude with a text from Thomas Merton that I discovered in the unpublished version of the typescript of the Sign of Jonas. It's a passage that never made it into the published version of the Sign of Jonas. Either Merton cut it out, or the publisher cut it out, or more ominously, the censors cut it out. But anyway, in this passage that did not get into the published version of the Sign of Jonas, Merton distinguishes true solitude from what he calls narcissistic solitude on the one hand, and a crass activism on the other. And he sees both of these extremes as forms of escape, though moving in different directions. It is then that he makes this very significant statement. He says, our whole life must be a dialectic between community and solitude. Both are tremendously important, and our contemplative life subsists in the fruitful antagonism between these two terms. I think that's a tremendously important point, that our whole life must be a dialectic between community and solitude. We've got to talk with one another, and we've got to talk from wherever point we are. Both are tremendously important, our solitude and community. And then he goes on, as I say, to say, our contemplative life subsists in the fruitful antagonism between these two. I've already spoken about the antagonism that exists between the community and the collectivity. It may seem surprising, though perhaps it ought not, to speak of antagonism within the community itself. And yet, this is being real and realistic. Antagonism, perhaps, is a strong word. And yet, I am sure we all feel it at times in our own personal dialectic between the demands of community and those of solitude, as well as in the dialectic of the church. The important thing is that we let this antagonism be fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shannon. you see the two micros in the central alley. I now invite every one of you to become the teacher to Monsignor Shannon and enter into dialectic with him. If you have any question, come to the micro in the central alley so that your question can be properly recorded. And remember that every question has a depth which no answer can ever fully satisfy, to leave you off the hook.
You want to stand up for just a minute? You've been sitting for a long time, and maybe some of you would like to sneak out.
I'm glad you found it. I was looking for it.
Okay, fine, sure. Okay, fine, that's fine. There are some mics in the center aisle here if people want to use them to ask a question or to make a comment if you want.
I'm wondering, Monsignor Shannon, what do you think Thomas Merton's attitude would be to the coming Synod of Bishops?
It's always dangerous, isn't it, to try to decide what someone who is not able to defend himself any longer would say about a particular issue. I guess I would tend to think in two almost different directions, perhaps answering it in a dialectical way. I think that Merton would feel that he should probably do everything that he could to make contact with people who would be influential at that synod so that the gains achieved, and I think he would have considered them gains over the past 20 years, would not be written off at the synod. And I say this because this is what he did during the time of the council. He was writing to bishops. There is for example, in the letters, the first volume of the letters that I published, there is a correspondence with Cardinal Flaff that he carried on with him during the council. He wrote to bishops, he wrote to theologians, he wrote to Bernard Herring, he wrote to some lay people who were in Rome trying to get ideas to the bishops that would eventually come before the council. So I think that Merton would try to do what he could to see that the good work done by the council and the achievements since the council would be emphasized at this synod rather than put down. On the other hand, I think that Merton probably would not be really too much concerned about what would happen there, because I think that more and more as time went on, he began to feel that the real life of the church doesn't take place at the level of synods or even at the level of councils. It takes place in the hearts of those people who are persons in Christ. And therefore, I think he might have, as I say, one tendency to want to do all that he could to make the synod very positive, and there might be another feeling in him that it really doesn't matter that much because the real life of the church is going on and will go on whatever this synod does. Hopefully the synod will be helpful, but probably not a great deal. And maybe you're hearing me instead of Merton when I say that.
Sir, I was wondering what you think Merton would suggest one does in solitude and contemplation to develop one's wisdom and insight.
You're really asking me to give the talk that I'm going to give tomorrow at 8 o'clock or at 10 o'clock. If I can just try to suggest very briefly what, as I say, I'm going to say in much greater detail tomorrow, that I think for Merton that solitude and contemplation was a time to come to a deeper realization of our oneness with God and our oneness in God with all of reality and with all people. And not just saying this, but experiencing it. That contemplation is the experience of this oneness. And to be able to experience this, one really needs to move to a deeper level of consciousness so that the contemplative is, as Merton defines him, a person who is totally aware. And as I say, I don't want to give away too much of what I'm going to say tomorrow, but what I really hope to do is to analyze what is meant by total awareness. And I think that one achieves this total awareness in solitude, in quiet, by going in prayer to try to experience the presence of God, not through images, but by going beyond images. Not by concentrating on the self, but by forgetting about the self. Not long ago, a person came to me and asked me if I would be willing to give her some spiritual direction. We have a Trappist monastery not far from Rochester, the Abbey of the Genesee. They built some air raid shelters during the 60s, and Merton scoffs at them for doing that. That's in some of the letters to it. They don't like that he did that. But anyway, we have a Trappist monastery near Rochester, and this young woman came to me, a very intelligent person. She's a professor of literature and a writer. And she said, would you be willing to give me some spiritual direction? She said, I went to the Abbey and I asked one of the monks there if he would do this, and he said, we leave that to the Jesuits. Well, I don't know whether there are any Jesuits here or not, but I don't leave it to the Jesuits. I have great respect for the Jesuits and for the tremendous work that they are doing in spiritual formation, in giving retreats, and I applaud all that they have done for the updating of the exercises and the fact that they have come in and filled a gap where there is nothing else in the way of any kind of spiritual direction. But I have problems about that kind of spirituality. Basically, I guess I have problems with a post-Reformation spirituality. And I would like to see a spirituality that goes back to the pre-Reformation spirituality, to the spirituality of the fathers of the desert, the spirituality of the 14th century mystics, the Carmelite mystics. And this is a spirituality that does not concentrate on the self, but rather concentrates on trying to forget the self. And it does not try to form images of God, but to go beyond images of God. And fundamentally, this is what Merton means by contemplation. And I think it's very significant that the word contemplation has come to mean today the same thing as meditation, and the two are completely different. Although it's very confusing, because the kind of thing that Merton is talking about is what Zen people sometimes call meditation. But what in the West we call meditation means discursive reasoning, and contemplation is not discursive reasoning. What you do in solitude is not discursive reasoning, or at least if you do it in order to get beyond it. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that's all I'm willing to say tonight.
Monsignor, maybe you were answering some of that just now, but do you see a big difference between the mysticism of the Buddha monk and the contemplative stance that the Christian monk would take?
I'm always afraid when that question comes up, but it's a good question. I think a very important one. Merton said in the introduction to Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he said, I think that a person is better known by his questions than his answers. And I think this is one of the questions that we still have to continue dealing with. I might say this, that, and I'm not really, this is not really an attempt to give any kind of complete answer to your question, because I think one could write a book on it and still not give a complete answer. But when I edited the letters of Merton, some of the letters were letters written to various Christians who were not Roman Catholic, Anglicans, and Protestants, and some were written to non-Christians, to Jews, to Buddhists, to Hindus, and so on. And I was originally going to call those letters ecumenical letters, using the word ecumenical not in the strict sense of dialogue among Christians, but using it in the sense of dialogue among any religious group, and therefore including Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, and so on. Eventually, again, I think after a more careful reading of Merton's letters, and if I had the time I could give you some specific quotations that I'm referring to, I changed the title from Ecumenical Letters to Letters on Religious Experience. The reason I did that was that I do not think that Merton really was very much interested in ecumenism in the strict sense of the term. In the general sense of dialogue with other people, yes, of course. But in the strict sense of an ecumenism, which deals with the divisions that exist among various religions, and particularly for Christians, with the idea of trying to achieve unity, this is a unity that people are trying to achieve, a unity that has been lost through sinfulness and through infidelity to God's Word. Merton was not so much interested in this kind of unity that needed to be recovered. He was more interested, I think, in the unity that already existed among people at a level that not even sin could touch, and that is the level of the religious experience. Now, one of the implications you could take from my saying that is that my answer to your question is the Buddhist experience and the Christian experience, the same experience. One of the conclusions you might take from my answer is, yes, they are the same experience. But I wouldn't want you to take that answer, because I really think that we have not yet reached the point of sufficient communication with people of other religions really to be able to answer yes to that, even though I believe very heartily with Merton that there is a unity at a level that is deeper than all of our differences and all of our disunities, And that we discover that in contemplation. Now, does the Buddhist discover that same thing in his meditation? I think probably yes, but I don't know. Because I don't think, in other words, that we have had enough real dialogue to be able to give a certain answer to that. But at least I have an inclination toward an answer, if I may put it that way.